Number: Royal Fiction Story. First document. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble corridors of Kensington Palace as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his uniform and began his daily patrol. As a senior protection officer with 15 years of service to the royal family, Thomas had seen many changes within the palace walls. However, nothing could have prepared him for what he would witness on this particular Tuesday morning in October. Thomas had always prided himself on his discretion and loyalty. Born into a military family, he understood the importance of duty and honor. His father had served in the Royal Navy, and his grandfather had been a palace guard during Queen Elizabeth's early reign. The Mitchell family had a tradition of service that ran deeper than mere employment. Princess Charlotte, now 12 years old, had become the darling of the British public. Her infectious smile and natural charm reminded many of her late grandmother, Princess Diana. Unlike her brothers, Charlotte possessed a unique combination of royal grace and down-to-earth personality that endeared her to everyone she met. Thomas had watched her grow from a toddler into a confident young lady who carried herself with dignity beyond her years. The palace had been unusually quiet that morning. Prince William and Catherine had departed early for a charity engagement in Scotland, leaving Charlotte and her brothers in the care of their nanny and the household staff. Thomas was conducting his routine security check of the East Wing when he noticed unusual activity near the Queen Consort's private sitting room. Camilla had arrived unexpectedly, which struck Thomas as odd since she rarely visited Kensington Palace without prior arrangement. Her usual residence at Clarence House provided ample space for her official duties, and she typically coordinated her visits with other family members well in advance. Something about her demeanor seemed different today, more secretive, more purposeful. As Thomas approached the corridor leading to the sitting room, he could hear voices emanating from behind the partially closed door. Royal protocol dictated that he should announce his presence and continue with his duties. But something in the tone of the conversation made him pause. Years of training had taught him to recognize when situations deviated from normal patterns, and every instinct told him that this moment required careful attention. The first voice he recognized belonged to Camilla, but her tone carried an edge he had never heard before. She was speaking to someone with an authority that seemed to transcend her usual diplomatic manner. The second voice belonged to Lord Harrison Whitmore, a senior advisor who had served various members of the royal family for over 2 decades. Thomas knew Lord Whitmore as a calculating man who rarely involved himself in family matters unless significant interests were at stake. Thomas positioned himself near a decorative alcove where he could remain hidden while still maintaining a clear view of the sitting room entrance. His heart raced as he began to comprehend the gravity of the conversation taking place mere feet away. The words he heard would challenge everything he believed about duty, loyalty, and the very nature of the institution he had sworn to protect. Camilla's voice carried clearly through the partially open door as she outlined what could only be described as a systematic plan to undermine Princess Charlotte's position within the royal hierarchy. She spoke of Charlotte's growing popularity as a threat to the stability of the crown's future, suggesting that the young princess's natural charisma and public appeal could overshadow other members of the family. Lord Whitmore's responses revealed a detailed strategy that had apparently been developing for months. He referenced private polling data that showed Charlotte's favorability ratings surpassing those of several senior royals, including Camilla herself. The implications were clear. They viewed a 12-year-old child as a political threat that needed to be neutralized before she could fully understand her own potential. The conversation took an even more sinister turn when Camilla began discussing specific mechanisms for stripping Charlotte of her title and removing her from the line of succession. She mentioned obscure legal precedents and constitutional provisions that could potentially be invoked under certain circumstances. Thomas realized he was listening to a conspiracy that went far beyond mere family politics. This was an attempt to fundamentally alter the structure of the monarchy itself. As the discussion continued, Thomas learned that this plan had support from certain elements within the establishment, who viewed Charlotte's popularity as destabilizing. They feared that her eventual rise to a more prominent position could shift public attention away from the current power structure and create expectations for modernization that they were unwilling to meet. The most disturbing revelation came when Lord Whitmore suggested manufacturing a scandal that would taint Charlotte's reputation and provide justification for her removal from royal duties. They discussed the possibility of creating situations that would make her appear unfit for royal responsibilities. Despite her young age and exemplary behavior, Thomas felt his blood pressure rising as he listened to these powerful individuals casually discuss destroying the life and future of a child who had done nothing wrong except capture the hearts of the British people. His protective instincts, honed through years of safeguarding the royal family, screamed at him to take immediate action. The conversation revealed that they had already begun implementing preliminary steps of their plan. Certain media contacts had been cultivated to plant negative stories about Charlotte's education and behavior. Palace staff had been subtly reassigned to limit Charlotte's access to positive publicity opportunities. Even her schedule had been manipulated to reduce her public appearances and minimize her interaction with supportive family members. Thomas realized that this conspiracy explained several recent changes he had observed but not fully understood. Charlotte's reduced public appearances, the sudden transfer of her favorite nanny, and the increased restrictions on her activities all made sense when viewed through the lens of this systematic campaign against her. As he continued to listen, Thomas understood that he was witnessing something that would forever change his relationship with the institution he had served faithfully for so many years. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on him like a physical burden, forcing him to confront the possibility that loyalty to the crown might conflict with loyalty to individual members of the royal family. The conversation between Camilla and Lord Whitmore grew more animated as they discussed timeline and implementation details. Thomas heard mention of a crucial meeting scheduled for the following week, where final approval would be sought for the most dramatic elements of their plan. The urgency in their voices suggested that they believed time was running short. Perhaps other family members were beginning to suspect something, or maybe external pressures were forcing them to accelerate their schedule. Thomas knew that he stood at a crossroads that would define not only his career but his conscience. The oath he had taken to protect the royal family suddenly seemed more complex than he had ever imagined. Did protecting the institution mean allowing harm to come to one of its most vulnerable members? Could he remain silent while a child's future was deliberately destroyed by those who should be protecting her? The sound of approaching footsteps in the main corridor forced Thomas to make a quick decision about his immediate actions. He needed to retreat before being discovered, but he also needed to process what he had learned and determine his next course of action. The weight of this knowledge felt almost unbearable as he quietly moved away from the sitting room, his mind racing with the implications of what he had witnessed. As Thomas completed his patrol route, his thoughts kept returning to Princess Charlotte's bright smile and innocent enthusiasm. She had no idea that powerful forces within her own family were working to destroy her future before it could fully begin. The injustice of the situation gnawed at him, challenging every principle he held dear about fairness, protection, and the proper use of power. The remainder of Thomas's shift passed in a blur of conflicting emotions and moral calculations. He found himself studying the faces of other staff members, wondering who else might be aware of this conspiracy and who could be trusted with such explosive information. The palace, which had always felt like a second home, now seemed filled with potential threats and hidden agendas. As evening approached and Thomas prepared to end his shift, he knew that he could not simply return home and pretend that nothing had happened. The knowledge he carried demanded action, but the potential consequences of that action were staggering. Speaking out could end his career, destroy his family's legacy of royal service, and potentially expose him to legal retaliation from some of the most powerful people in the country. Yet the alternative, remaining silent while a conspiracy unfolded against an innocent child, seemed even more unthinkable. Thomas had spent his entire adult life protecting the royal family, and now he faced the ultimate test of what that protection truly meant. As he walked through the palace gates at the end of his shift, Thomas Mitchell carried with him a secret that would force him to choose between institutional loyalty and moral courage. Number: Royal Fiction Story, Second Document. The sleepless night that followed Thomas Mitchell's discovery seemed to stretch endlessly as he wrestled with the weight of what he had learned. His small flat in South London felt claustrophobic as he paced from room to room, unable to settle his mind or find peace in familiar surroundings. The television news showed footage of Princess Charlotte at a recent school event. Her radiant smile and graceful demeanor, a stark contrast to the dark conspiracy Thomas now knew was brewing against her. Thomas had always been a methodical man, trained to think through problems systematically before taking action. However, this situation defied his usual analytical approach because the stakes were so personal and the potential consequences so far-reaching. He found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the royal family and the institution he had dedicated his life to protecting. The morning brought no relief from his internal turmoil, but it did bring clarity about what needed to happen next. Thomas knew he could not carry this burden alone, nor could he allow the conspiracy to proceed unchallenged. The question was not whether to act, but how to act in a way that would effectively protect Princess Charlotte, while minimizing the damage to himself and other innocent parties. Thomas's first consideration was whether to approach Prince William and Catherine directly with his information. As Charlotte's parents, they had the right to know about threats to their daughter, and they certainly had the power to intervene effectively. However, Thomas also understood that such a direct approach could backfire spectacularly if his allegations were not handled carefully, or if other palace insiders learned of his involvement before protective measures could be put in place. Another option involved reaching out to other senior protection officers or palace staff who might have noticed suspicious activities or changes in protocol. Thomas realized that he could not be the only person who had observed unusual patterns in recent weeks, and building a coalition of witnesses might strengthen his position when the time came to present his evidence. The most dramatic option would be to confront Camilla directly, which carried enormous risks but also offered the possibility of ending the conspiracy before it could cause real harm. Thomas understood that such a confrontation would require careful planning and perfect execution, as any misstep could result in his immediate dismissal and the loss of his ability to protect Charlotte from within the system. As Thomas prepared for another shift at the palace, he made the decision to gather additional evidence before taking any irreversible action. He needed to understand the full scope of the conspiracy, identify all the key players involved, and document as much as possible to ensure that his eventual accusations would be credible and comprehensive. The palace felt different to Thomas as he began his duties that Wednesday morning. Every conversation seemed potentially significant. Every interaction carried the possibility of revealing new information about the plot against Princess Charlotte. Thomas found himself hyper-aware of his surroundings, noting details and patterns that might have escaped his attention in the past. His opportunity for further investigation came when he was assigned to security duties during a private meeting between Camilla and several senior palace advisors. The meeting was ostensibly about upcoming royal engagements and protocol adjustments, but Thomas suspected it might provide additional insight into the conspiracy he had uncovered. Thomas positioned himself strategically outside the meeting room, where he could monitor the discussion without appearing suspicious. The conversation initially focused on routine matters: scheduling conflicts, media appearances, and coordination between different royal households. However, as the meeting progressed, the tone shifted toward more sensitive topics. Lord Whitmore's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected the lives of others without their knowledge or consent. He provided updates on what he called the Charlotte situation, speaking in code, but making his meaning clear to those who understood the context. Thomas learned that they had already made progress in certain areas of their plan, with some media outlets beginning to publish subtly negative coverage of the young princess. The conversation revealed that they had also been working to isolate Charlotte from potential allies within the royal family and the broader establishment. Certain family friends had been discouraged from maintaining close relationships with Prince William and Catherine, while influential figures who had previously supported Charlotte's public role were being systematically alienated through various political and social pressures. Thomas was shocked to discover that the conspiracy extended beyond mere title stripping to include plans for Charlotte's complete removal from public life. They discussed the possibility of sending her away to boarding school in another country, ostensibly for her education but actually to reduce her visibility and influence within British society. The casual way they spoke about separating a child from her family for political reasons filled Thomas with a rage he had never experienced before. Even more disturbing was their discussion of backup plans, in case their primary strategy failed to achieve the desired results. Lord Whitmore mentioned having prepared documentation that could be used to question Charlotte's legitimacy or suitability for royal duties, though the specific details of these documents remained unclear from Thomas's position outside the room. As the meeting continued, Thomas realized that this conspiracy involved far more people than he had initially suspected. Names were mentioned of media figures, political advisors, and even some palace staff who were apparently cooperating with the effort to undermine Charlotte's position. The scope of the operation was staggering, involving coordination across multiple institutions and levels of British society. The most chilling moment came when Camilla expressed concern about potential opposition from other family members if they discovered what was happening. She specifically mentioned worrying about how Prince Harry might react if he learned about the plot, suggesting that his protective instincts toward family members and his willingness to challenge royal protocol could pose a significant threat to their plans. Thomas understood that this concern revealed both the conspiracy's vulnerability and its urgency. If they feared discovery by other royals, it meant their window for action was limited, and they were likely planning to accelerate their timeline to avoid exposure. This realization added a new dimension of urgency to Thomas's own decision-making process. The meeting concluded with assignments for various participants to carry out specific elements of the plan over the following weeks. Thomas heard enough to understand that they were moving into an active phase of implementation, which meant that Princess Charlotte was in immediate danger of suffering real harm from their actions. As the participants filed out of the meeting room, Thomas made a crucial observation about their body language and interactions. These were not reluctant conspirators acting under duress. They were enthusiastic participants in what they clearly viewed as a necessary political operation. The casual cruelty with which they discussed destroying a child's life revealed a moral bankruptcy that shocked Thomas even after his years of observing palace politics. The remainder of Thomas's shift was spent in careful observation and note-taking. He documented times, participants, and as many specific details as he could remember. From the conversations he had overheard, Thomas understood that if he was going to expose this conspiracy, he would need to present evidence that was both comprehensive and verifiable. That evening, Thomas made the decision that would define the rest of his life and potentially change the future of the British monarchy. He would confront Camilla directly, not to negotiate or seek compromise, but to make it absolutely clear that her conspiracy had been discovered and would not be tolerated. Thomas spent hours planning his approach, considering every possible response Camilla might have to his confrontation. He understood that she would likely deny everything initially, then attempt to discredit him or question his motives. She might try to have him dismissed immediately or take legal action to silence him. However, Thomas also knew that his direct knowledge of her plans gave him significant leverage, particularly if he made it clear that others were aware of his discoveries. The decision to act was not driven by any desire for personal gain or recognition. Thomas understood that confronting Camilla would likely end his career and possibly expose him to serious retaliation. However, he also understood that his oath to protect the royal family meant protecting all of its members, especially those who were most vulnerable and unable to protect themselves. As he prepared for what might be his final shift as a palace protection officer, Thomas felt a sense of peace that had eluded him since his discovery of the conspiracy. He had spent his entire adult life serving an institution he believed in, and now he would demonstrate the true meaning of that service by standing up to those who would abuse their power for personal gain. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only Thomas's courage but also the very foundations of the institution he had served so faithfully. Princess Charlotte's future hung in the balance, and Thomas Mitchell was the only person in a position to protect her from those who should have been her greatest defenders. Number Royal Fiction Story, third document. Thursday morning arrived with an autumn chill that seemed to mirror the tension Thomas Mitchell felt as he approached what would become the most important confrontation of his life. He had barely slept, spending the dark hours rehearsing his words and preparing for every possible response to his planned confrontation with Camilla. The weight of Princess Charlotte's future rested on his shoulders, and Thomas understood that he might have only one opportunity to protect her from the conspiracy that threatened to destroy her life. Thomas had learned from the palace schedule that Camilla would be arriving for a private appointment at 10 o'clock, ostensibly to review arrangements for an upcoming charitable engagement. However, given what Thomas now knew about her recent activities, he suspected this meeting was actually another planning session for the conspiracy against Charlotte. The timing would be perfect for his intervention. Public enough that she could not simply have him disappear, but private enough for a frank conversation about what he had discovered. As he prepared for his shift, Thomas reflected on the irony of his situation. For 15 years, he had protected the royal family from external threats, never imagining that the greatest danger to one of its members would come from within. The training that had prepared him to identify and neutralize physical threats seemed inadequate for dealing with the political and emotional complexity of this situation. The palace bustled with its usual morning activity as staff prepared for the day's events. Thomas observed his colleagues with new eyes, wondering which of them might be aware of the conspiracy and which were, like him, completely oblivious to the dark currents flowing beneath the surface of royal life. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal given what Thomas knew was really happening behind the gilded walls and ceremonial protocols. Camilla arrived precisely on schedule, her public demeanor as composed and regal as always. To any observer, she appeared to be exactly what she claimed to be, a dedicated member of the royal family, fulfilling her duties with dignity and grace. Only Thomas knew the truth about the woman behind the carefully constructed public image. Thomas waited until Camilla had settled into her private sitting room before making his approach. He had chosen his timing carefully, ensuring that she would be alone, but expecting her meeting to begin soon. This would give him the maximum opportunity to present his case while minimizing the chance of interruption or interference from her allies. The walk down the corridor to Camilla's sitting room felt like the longest journey of Thomas's life. Each step brought him closer to a point of no return, where his comfortable existence as a loyal palace employee would end forever. However, Thomas also felt a sense of clarity and purpose that had been missing from his life for years. Finally, he was about to take action that truly mattered, that would make a real difference in protecting someone who could not protect herself. Thomas knocked firmly on the sitting room door and waited for permission to enter. When Camilla's voice called for him to come in, he opened the door and stepped into what felt like a lion's den. The room was elegantly appointed with antique furniture and royal portraits, a setting that normally would have reminded Thomas of the grandeur and tradition he served. Today, it felt like a stage for moral confrontation. Camilla looked up from her papers with surprise and slight irritation at the unexpected interruption. Her expression shifted to curiosity and then concern as she registered the seriousness in Thomas's demeanor. Years of royal training had taught her to read people quickly, and she clearly sensed that this was not a routine security check or minor administrative matter. Thomas had rehearsed his opening words carefully, but when the moment came, he found himself speaking from the heart rather than from his prepared script. He told Camilla directly that he had overheard her conversations with Lord Whitmore and that he knew about the conspiracy to strip Princess Charlotte of her title and remove her from public life. The words came out calmly but firmly, leaving no doubt about the seriousness of his accusations. The change in Camilla's expression was immediate and dramatic. The mask of royal composure slipped for just a moment, revealing shock, anger, and calculation in rapid succession. Thomas watched her process the implications of his knowledge and begin formulating her response. He could almost see her mind working through various strategies for dealing with this unexpected threat to her plans. Camilla's initial response was exactly what Thomas had predicted: complete denial of any conspiracy or improper activity. She adopted a tone of wounded dignity, suggesting that Thomas had misunderstood innocent conversations or allowed his imagination to create sinister meanings from routine palace business. Her performance was convincing, and Thomas understood how she had managed to deceive so many people for so long. However, Thomas was prepared for this denial and had specific details that made her position impossible to maintain. He recounted exact quotes from her conversations, mentioned specific names and dates, and described plans that could not possibly have innocent explanations. As he presented this evidence, Thomas watched Camilla's confidence begin to erode as she realized the extent of his knowledge. When denial proved ineffective, Camilla shifted to intimidation. She reminded Thomas of his position as a mere employee, subject to dismissal at any time, and without recourse. She suggested that making wild accusations against senior members of the royal family would not only end his career, but could result in serious legal consequences. The threat was delivered with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to having her will obeyed without question. Thomas had expected this response as well, and was ready with his counter-argument. He calmly explained that he had documented everything he had learned, and that copies of his evidence were in safe hands outside the palace. He made it clear that any retaliation against him would only serve to validate his accusations and draw more attention to the conspiracy. The balance of power in the room shifted, as Camilla realized that her usual tactics would not work against someone who had planned so carefully. The conversation took on a more serious tone as both parties recognized that they were engaged in a high-stakes negotiation rather than a simple confrontation. Camilla began to probe Thomas's motivations, trying to understand whether he could be bought, threatened, or reasoned into silence. She offered him promotions, transfers to prestigious positions, and even direct financial incentives in exchange for his discretion. Thomas's response revealed the depth of his commitment to protecting Princess Charlotte. He explained that his loyalty was not to any individual member of the royal family but to the institution itself and the principles it was supposed to represent. He argued that allowing a conspiracy against a child to succeed would damage the monarchy far more than exposing and stopping that conspiracy. As the conversation continued, Thomas presented Camilla with a stark choice. She could voluntarily abandon her plans against Princess Charlotte and use her influence to protect the young princess from further attacks, or Thomas would take his evidence to Prince William and Catherine and let them decide how to handle the situation. The ultimatum was delivered calmly, but with unmistakable resolve. Camilla's response revealed both her desperation and her miscalculation of Thomas's character. She attempted to justify her actions by painting Charlotte as a threat to the stability of the monarchy, suggesting that the young princess's popularity could destabilize the careful balance of royal succession and public attention. Her arguments revealed a paranoid and self-serving worldview that shocked Thomas with its casual cruelty. Thomas countered by pointing out that Charlotte was a 12-year-old child who had done nothing wrong except be born into her position and possess natural charisma. He argued that punishing a child for qualities that should be celebrated represented exactly the kind of institutional corruption that was eroding public confidence in the monarchy. His words clearly struck home, as Camilla's justifications began to sound hollow even to herself. The turning point in the confrontation came when Thomas made it clear that he was not seeking to negotiate or compromise. He was there to inform Camilla that her conspiracy had been discovered and must end immediately. Any further actions against Princess Charlotte would be met with immediate exposure of the entire plot, along with evidence of everyone involved. The certainty and determination in his voice left no doubt about his willingness to follow through on his threats. Camilla's final attempt to regain control involved an appeal to Thomas's supposed loyalty to the crown. She argued that exposing internal royal conflicts would damage the institution they both claimed to serve, and that maintaining discretion was the highest form of loyalty. Her words revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what true loyalty meant to someone like Thomas. Thomas's response defined not only the end of their confrontation but also the moral center of the entire situation. He explained that real loyalty meant protecting the innocent and standing up to those who would abuse their power for personal gain. He argued that the monarchy's strength came from its connection to principles of justice and protection of the vulnerable, not from blind obedience to those who happened to hold positions of authority. The confrontation ended with Camilla's reluctant agreement to abandon her plans against Princess Charlotte. Though Thomas understood that this agreement came from fear of exposure rather than any genuine change of heart, he made it clear that he would be watching for any signs that the conspiracy was continuing in any form, and that he had allies both within and outside the palace who would support his efforts to protect the young princess. As Thomas left Camilla's sitting room, he felt the weight of his 15-year career settling on his shoulders for the final time. He knew that his days as a palace protection officer were numbered, regardless of Camilla's promises or agreements. However, he also knew that Princess Charlotte would be safer because of his actions, and that knowledge made any personal sacrifice worthwhile. The aftermath of the confrontation brought both relief and uncertainty to Thomas's life. Within days, he received notice of his transfer to a less prestigious position, ostensibly for routine administrative reasons, but clearly as retaliation for his challenge to Camilla's authority. However, Thomas also noticed positive changes in Princess Charlotte's situation. Her public appearances resumed their normal frequency, restrictions on her activities were quietly lifted, and the subtle negative media coverage ceased almost immediately. Thomas Mitchell's act of courage had protected an innocent child from those who would have destroyed her future for their own gain. Though his career paid the price for his moral stand, Thomas found peace in knowing that he had fulfilled the true meaning of his oath to protect the royal family. Princess Charlotte would grow up free from the conspiracy that had threatened to derail her life, never knowing how close she had come to losing everything, or who had stood up to protect her when she needed it most.